Last week, we focused on women's bodies and the internal reproductive tract, extending from the external to the internal, all the way to the ovaries, and how it works. This week, we'll be focusing on men's bodies, and in particular, we'll look at penises. This is the external reproductive organ for men. However, there's tons of machinery inside as well. And I want to note two things before we begin. One, remember that I will want you to be able to track the path that sperm, which is the gamete or the reproductive cell of men, the path that sperm take from where they're created through the male reproductive tract, out the penis, and then into the female reproductive tract, and how it ends up getting to the egg. You should be able to track that entire path by the time I conclude this lecture, because you'll be equipped with both the male and female reproductive anatomy. The other thing I want to remind you is that I said that the male and female genitalia are actually in some ways more similar than they are different. They're made from the same kind of tissue in utero. And so I want you to, again, keep that in mind as we go through the structures and see that there are analogous structures. There are parts of the penis that are structurally the same or similar to that of the vulva and the vagina. So let's dive right in. This is a penis. There are a few structures of note. One, if you look at the very tip, you have the glands, and that's probably the part that everyone's most familiar with. This is the most sensitive part of the penis. This is where the largest concentration of nerves tends to cluster. If you think about the female clitoris, this is analogous to the glands of the clitoris. Remember, it was highly reduced, much smaller in women, but it serves the same function, and it's made from the same tissue. Now, it just so happens that the clitoris actually tends to have more nerve endings. It's even more sensitive than the tip of the male penis, but they come from the same source. Right below the glands, you have this ridge that encircles the penis, and this is called the corona. This actually, funnily enough, has a number of, you may have never thought of this before, but there is a particular function that this is presumed to play, and that is with something called sperm competition. We may talk about this a little bit later, but there is a pattern observed among non-humans that is fairly well observed, called sperm competition, where multiple men will mate with the same female, and they will ejaculate into her reproductive tract in an attempt to get her pregnant. Well, one of the things that you can do when you have multi-mating, that is, you have several males mating with a female at once, is that you can have certain strategies, certain tactics for attempting to remove that sperm from the vaginal canal. The idea is that the corona may serve the function of dragging competitors' sperm out of the reproductive tract. So that is, if you have this ridge, it's going to create enough surface area that once the penis is inserted into the vagina, as it pulls back out, it may pull other men's sperm out in these multi-mating situations. Again, this is well documented in non-human animals. There is some evidence that this happens in humans as well, but the competition may happen at the level of the sperm. And again, we may talk about that a little bit later. I want you to realize that it's there. You'll notice right in the center you have something called the frenulum. And anyone who is circumcised, you will very clearly see this frenulum, and it seems like it's just kind of there and it's a wrinkled piece of skin. But originally its purpose was to attach the foreskin to the glands. And if you look at the bottom left, you'll see that this is what the foreskin would look like for anyone who's not circumcised. So there is a sheath that naturally covers the glands, and it kind of, it's attached by the frenulum, and it covers the entire glands, almost as to protect it. That's the foreskin. Now, most people have this, many people, at least in westernized countries and those who are predominantly Christian in particular, and with a Jewish heritage as well, tend to have this removed. And this tradition originally seemed to, the original formulation seems to have stuck around largely because of hygiene. So there is actually several problems that can occur if you keep the foreskin on. And in particular, that foreskin has cracks in it. There are little grooves where stuff can get caught. And if stuff is caught in there, it can serve as a breeding ground for bacteria and other harmful things. And so originally it was cut off as a hygiene practice. It has become routine. It's in many cases become part of certain religious practices, particularly within Christianity. And so it's just a practice that people do now, almost out of habit. And they may not necessarily think of the hygiene advantages. The thing is now, our technology for hygiene has gotten to a point where we don't really need to do this anymore. Access to soap, clean water, etc. is so widely available that this is actually starting to be seen as a harmful practice to have your child circumcised. The reality is, if the glans has tons of nerves that assists in the pleasure of sex, that kind of helps in stimulation, the foreskin actually has a number of those same nerves. So what you're doing when you remove the foreskin is you may be removing some of the same types of the ability to feel stimulation, to enjoy sex. A certain amount of pleasure can be lost by removing the foreskin. So when you have a child, or whenever that happens to be the case, if you do, consider this, that getting rid of the foreskin may be still the predominant practice, especially in many Western societies. But we've gotten to a point technologically where we don't really need to do this practice anymore. And so it may be the more humane option to not have your child circumcised. As you travel further down the penis, this is the shaft. And so this is the part that will swell. Underneath, we'll see in a moment, there is tissue that blood will flow into to form an erection. As we go further down, we then have the scrotum, and that is where the testes will be housed. This is a flap of skin that encompasses the two testicles and provides protection to them, various types of protection, which we'll also go over. There's a tube, essentially, that runs across the bottom of the penis. What we're looking at here is we're looking at the underside, as if you were to take the penis and kind of press it against the pubic, the mons, essentially, the pubic bone, the upper pubic area. And that tube is surrounded by something. So if you're a guy, or if you're just kind of near a penis and you want to explore this a little bit, you can feel that. So if you're looking at an erect penis, or you're feeling an erect penis, most of it is relatively solid. But then underneath there's that tube, there's a bulge that has a little bit more give to it. Well, if we look inside and we see what's causing what, that underside, so if you look on the right side, this is a cross section of the penis such that you can see down the shaft. At the very bottom there, you have corpus spongiosum, which is something we've encountered before. The clitoris had corpus spongiosum, and that was that created the vestibular bulbs. Those, at least within the diagram that I showed you, the yellow-colored structures that came down on either side of the vaginal canal. Relatively spongier, had some give to it, but still filled with blood. Well, same here. We have corpus spongiosum that has a relatively more give to it. That's why the underside of the penis, that tube, you can press on it, you can squeeze it. What's happening there is through that part passes the urethra, through which urine passes. And so urine needs to flow, it needs to have room to go, and it may need to expand. So you have that corpus spongiosum to allow that expansion. The rest of the penis is relatively solid though, and the reason it is one, you're going to have vasocongestion, just as much as you would for the vulva and the vagina. And the same kinds of tissue are expanding because of that blood and then becoming firm. And remember that the firm type of tissue is corpus cavernosa. So those structures, the crura that came down on the right and left side of the clitoris, again surrounding the vaginal opening, that were relatively more solid, we have that same tissue in the penis. So I want you to be aware of this anatomy. You can see that at the very end, where you're looking at the corona and the glands, that is made of corpus spongiosum. Again, why the penis tends to be spongier, more pliable at the end, and then relatively harder and movable down the shaft. How do we get an erection? Well, turns out, unsurprisingly, stimulation causes erection for men, quite reliably too. And so again, we call that vasocongestion. At the very top right of this slide, you'll see kind of an electron microscope image of what the tip of the penis contains. So these are called genital end bulbs. You can see that there are nerve fibers at the bottom right of the image, nerve fibers coming up towards the surface of the glands of the penis. And then right at the end, they kind of cluster in this group. What this does is it permits for greater stimulation. If you have more nerves kind of packed into a certain area, then when you stimulate that area, you will experience a much more intense sensation. That's what makes the glands of both the penis and the vagina more sensitive. So to get an erection, what happens is, first off, the blood vessels are constricted at rest. So there are many blood vessels flowing into the penis that bring blood to the corpus cavernosa and the corpus spongiosum. And so what happens is those blood vessels are constricted. They're not letting blood through. So the reason that a penis is flaccid is simply that there's really not much blood flowing there. It can't get in. When these genital end bulbs are stimulated, what that does is it tells those blood vessels to open up and say, hey, listen, something's going on, something's touching the penis. We better let blood get in there. There might be sex on the table. So the blood vessels open up, and there are these structures called sinusoids within the corpus cavernosa that fill with blood. I'll go back just a second. You can see that the sinusoids, are they labeled on here? I believe they were. I suppose they aren't. But if you look at the corpus cavernosa, you can see these pockets of blood, kind of darker red areas. Those are the sinusoids. So these are cavities that fill with blood. The vessels bring them in, those cavities fill up. Then what happens is the erection, the act of actually having a hardened penis, closes the veins that drain the blood. I'll say this, anyone who did not take a basic anatomy class, veins are, so there are two types of blood vessels. There are arteries that bring blood to an organ, and veins that take blood away. So when an erection happens, those veins actually get constricted, they get closed off, so that you have blood in there, but it can't escape. That's how you maintain an erection. Literally, it's physically causing those veins to block, to close. What keeps things stimulated, what keeps the erection, what causes it and then maintains it elsewise, is a neurotransmitter called nitric oxide, and this stimulates erection. And so a neurotransmitter is a chemical that is released by neurons to cause something to happen. So in the case of your muscle cells, for example, there's a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. A neuron will hook into a muscle, release acetylcholine, and that chemical causes the muscle to contract. In much the same way, nitric oxide is going to stimulate that erection. It's going to allow that blood to come in, and it's going to assist in that process of closing off the veins. When you take any kind of drug to stimulate erection, usually the main ingredient is nitric oxide. Or, and there are two possibilities here, either it contains nitric oxide itself, or in the case of Viagra, for example, it increases your sensitivity to nitric oxide. So you're either getting that artificial nitric oxide itself, or the receptors that accept that chemical, that chemical binds to within the penis, they become more sensitive. That is, they respond much more strongly to nitric oxide than they otherwise would. Now, you hear those commercials about, okay, if your erection lasts longer than 4 hours, make sure you go see a doctor. The reason for that is quite clear when you know how this works. If an erection is going to close off the drainage of blood, what that means is if you have an erection for too long, you're going to have old, unoxygenated, used up blood within your penis for a prolonged period of time. It needs to eventually drain away. If it doesn't, new blood can't get in, which means you can't have nutrients, you can't have sugar getting into where it needs to be. Oxygen, blood carries oxygen as well, which is important for organ maintenance. So the idea is if you have an erection for too long, new blood is not getting in there, therefore it can damage the tissue. So, no joke, if it lasts longer than 4 hours, or for some reason you are erect for more than 4 hours, give yourself a break or go find a doctor. I mentioned the pelvic floor muscles for women previously as muscles that assist with contracting and contracting the vaginal wall. And it's the thing that you flex when you're attempting to close off the urethra, when you need to pee, etc. Well, same for men. Men also have pelvic floor muscles. And in terms of maintaining an erection, what the pelvic floor muscles do is that they will, flexing them, squeezes and pulls on the corpus cavernosa and the spongiosum. So imagine you have, this is honestly the best analogy I can give you. Imagine you have a tube of toothpaste and you want that tube of toothpaste to be as compact with toothpaste as you can. What you'll do is you'll take the end, you'll squeeze it, and then you'll try to wring the toothpaste up towards the mouth of the toothpaste container. That's the same thing. If you want to have blood and keep blood in the erection, then what you need to do is squeeze it and then pull back so that you push the blood towards the tip. That's what the pelvic floor muscles are doing, in case you didn't know. Nocturnal emissions are interesting. So these are, having wet dreams. That is, you're sleeping, you have a really sexy dream, you wake up, and you may have ejaculated. And so it's kind of messy. Nocturnal emissions are common. Most people get them at some point during their life. Both men and women can get them, but it's more noticeable for men because men will actually ejaculate. Women may certainly be wet or lubricated when they wake up, but usually not much messier than that. I want to note that this actually tracks the sleep cycle. I'm not going to give you an entire rundown of how sleep works, but there are these periods called the REM period of sleep. If you take my Psych 101 class, you will learn about these, where dreams happen. So when you dream, you are in this REM stage. Well, it turns out these nocturnal emissions map onto when those REM stages happen. So the idea is you are typically having a nocturnal emission while you're dreaming. And the REM period seems to be the most, physiologically you are more aroused during REM sleep. That is, REM sleep actually resembles waking consciousness. So of all the times that you would be more stimulated and therefore more likely to experience sexual arousal, it's during this period. All right, besides the penis, and I apologize for this image, even I have been teaching this for a while, and something about a cross-sectioned penis still makes me a little queasy. I want to talk about the scrotum a little bit, because it does house the testes, but it's actually a very complex structure. So the scrotum is the entire structure. It's that fleshy sac, and it contains the testes, which are the male reproductive gonads. So these are what are going to actually produce sperm. We then have, I want you to notice the spermatic cord. If you go to the very top, it's labeled there. It's referring to the entire structure that extends down from the body to the testes. And it's the collection of muscle, of various tubes, of blood vessels that provide everything that the testes need and connect it to the body. This is you can actually feel the spermatic cord. If you kind of go in, again, if you have access to a scrotum, you go in there and you kind of feel around the back the back of the scrotum and then up towards the base of the penis, and you feel around, you can actually feel the two cords that extend down. Again, these are very important. You don't want these blocked off. You don't want these damaged in any way. Otherwise, you'll tend to also see damage to the testes. There is muscle tissue, and I will refer to a particular type of muscle called the cremaster muscle soon, which is important for helping regulate and protect the testes, regulate its temperature and protect it from physical damage. There's the epididymis. This is actually nestled up right next to the testicle. So you can look down at that purple testicle. Right at the tip, you have this epididymis. We'll see soon that this is the part where sperm tends to mature. And then we have the vas deferens, which extend from the epididymis up into the rest of the body. It's kind of hard to see in this image, but it is labeled. It is a thin tube that extends up into the beyond the spermatic cord. The point of the scrotum, the reason that it's so fleshy and it dangles down, is because it needs to. It regulates the temperature of the testes. And it does it in primarily two ways. One, sweat glands. Sweaty balls are a thing. There are tons of sweat glands in the balls. And the sperm need a perfect temperature that is not body temperature to create, the testes need that to create sperm. So if they're too close, the sperm can't survive. And if they're too far away, then it might be too cold. So you need them in that perfect, nice spot. But if your body is already too warm or you're in a warm environment, sweat is something that helps regulate temperature. When you sweat, how that works, for those who don't realize, is the sweat itself does not cool you down. What cools you down is when that sweat evaporates from your body. So when it turns from a liquid into a gas, it's going to take some of the heat and disperse it into the air. This is important to know. So although sweat will cool down the scrotum, ultimately they need to be aired out. That vapor needs somewhere to go. So if you got sweaty balls, air them out. Muscles also help with temperature regulation, and the cremaster muscle is especially important. It slings around the testicles. So you can see here that the cremaster muscle on the right makes something of a pouch. That pouch, depending on whether you are cold or whether you are too hot, or if there is danger, that cremaster muscle is going to contract or expand. So if you are particularly warm, the cremaster muscle will relax to allow the testicle to be further away from the body. Versus if you're cold, what usually happens is when you're cold, the scrotum seems to shrink in on itself. It hugs up against the body. And the cremaster muscle is responsible for that. It will pull the testes towards the body to warm them up because they may be too cold. The other situation in which the cremaster muscle will contract is in response to danger. So if you're ever scared, if it ever seems like your testicles are in danger, you might also notice that they just kind of suck up right in there. Again, it's protective. These are really important. These are necessary for you to reproduce. So they're in a very vulnerable position in some regards. But your body also has this defense response of sucking them up into the body if things get a little too heated, a little too dangerous. Okay. Some of this I've already mentioned, but I want to again draw attention to the similarities between between men and women. And the similarity here is that the testes are analogous to female ovaries. Recall that the female ovaries did two things. They housed eggs, that is, they housed the follicle, which is a combination of egg plus supporting fluid, and they produced sex hormones, those three hormones we talked about before: androgens, such as testosterone, estrogens, and progestin, such as progesterone. The testes will also produce these three. Now, whereas the ovaries create more estrogen and progesterone, which is typically more needed for women, by women, compared to men, Men will still produce those. They still produce estrogen and progestin, which are important for various functions of the body. But testes will specifically create more androgen, more testosterone, than ovaries will. Those are the two functions of the testes: produce sperm, produce sex hormones. And then I already mentioned these. The spermatic cord nourishes and connects the testes to the body. It's that main lifeline, what attaches them to everything else. And then the cremaster muscle, which forms a sling around the testicle, and it contracts in response to cold and danger. Be familiar with these parts. Okay. That is the external anatomy. That is what you see when you look on the outside. Next lecture, we'll delve deeper and look at how do we make sperm, and then how do we get sperm out of the internal male reproductive tract.